Okay, back with exercise 11.5. This is number 10. A cook bakes 6 different cakes, each time testing a new additive in an attempt to make a cake that will glow in the dark. All the additives containing chemical X produce a cake that glows in the dark. The other additives result in a normal cake. The cook concludes that chemical X makes a cake glow in the dark. So note what's going on in this passage is that one thing is there's comparison going on, right? So the comparison in this case means that the method of difference is being used, right? Glowing cakes versus non-glowing cakes. But in addition to that, there's also an identification of what's common to all the glowing cakes, namely this chemical X, right? And so when you have a common element for the effect, that's agreement. So this then is the joint method of agreement and difference. So, and again, I think this one, number 10 and number 8, which is the one about the bait and the fisherman, are pretty similar. So that's why I said I think there's a case to be made for the joint method for this one. But the reasoning in number 8 proceeds only from the comparison, right? It's only saying because these two groups are different and this is the difference between them, that's why the bait is working. So that's why this one, and if you look at the back of the book at the answers he has the answer difference for number 8. Right? Whereas number 10, there's both a comparison between the two, but also a positive identification of what's similar with respect to the glowing cakes. So that's why this one's more clearly a joint method of agreement and disagreement, or agreement and difference. Okay, number 12. During the 19th century, scientists searched for the cause of the bone disease called rickets. At first, it was thought the disease was related to poverty because many who had it were poor. One obvious hypothesis was suggested: perhaps rickets is caused by malnutrition. However, that hypothesis was ruled out when rickets were found among people who were neither poor nor malnourished. A common factor was finally found: a lack of sunlight. The conclusion was that lack of sunlight can cause rickets. So again, notice there's a comparison being made here specifically between the people who have rickets and the people who don't, right? The ones who had it were poor and the ones who didn't have it were rich. So that difference is what caused them to hypothesize malnutrition. So there's definitely, there's definitely comparison being made here, and the difference between two groups, the ones who got the disease and the ones who didn't, is used to reason to a causal explanation, right? So there's difference going on. But in the second half of the passage, they find a common feature that all people who have rickets have, right? So again, this one proceeds both from looking at how people with rickets are different from people without. That's the difference. But then also reasoning from a common factor to all the people who do have rickets. And that's the agreement. So again, this is the joint method of difference and agreement, or agreement and difference, whatever. Doesn't matter what order. Right? So again, the key point here is there's a comparison between the people who have it and the people who don't. That's part of the reasoning here. But also the common factor among all the people who have it, right? Lack of sunlight. And notice when I say common factor, it's not just the common factor is that they lack the characteristic that the ones who have it have. It's like actually finding something like lack of sunlight, or in the previous example, chemical X, right? So there's a common thing identified, like an actual existing positive common thing, not just saying, well, they all lack this thing. All right, so it's a factor, not just an absence of a factor. All right, 14. In 1886, while working at an asylum on the island of Java, the Dutch physician Christian Eichmann sought the cause of the disease beriberi. He found that hens in the courtyard of the asylum behaved like humans who had the disease. Upon further investigation, he discovered that eating of polished rice by humans and chickens was closely correlated with high rates of disease. After he could find no other factor, Eichmann concluded that beriberi is caused by a diet of polished rice, and further evidence shows it's caused by a deficiency. All right. So again, notice here there's a comparison between those who have it and those who don't, and an identification of what the one group has and the other group doesn't, namely this eating of polished rice. All right. So the reasoning here is based only on the difference. In fact, it explicitly says he could find no other factor, meaning common factor. So he is reasoning from difference alone, not from what they all have in common. So that's why this one is the method of difference. All right, and number 16, a politician who studied at the Gorgias School of Rhetoric is testing a new stump speech. Now, Gorgias was a philosopher. Well, not really a philosopher. He was what's called a sophist who went around ancient Athens teaching students how to speak, persuasively, how to win arguments, and things like that. The sophists in ancient Greece often clashed with Socrates because Socrates was searching for truth and the sophists were just trying to win arguments. So Gorgias was a pretty famous sophist back in the day. That's why you get this name of the school. All right. So a politician who studied the Gorgias School of Rhetoric is testing a new stump speech. After delivering his speech to 100 audience, the results are in. Among other favorite targets, his speech hits stamp collectors. Every speech is the same except one variable, his attack on stamp collectors. He varies the severity of this part from town to town. The harder he hits stamp collectors, the more money he takes in. The softer he is on stamp collectors, the lighter the donations and the smaller the applause. His advisors conclude that smacking the stamp collecting community causes campaign donations to rise. And in my little hint here, I say, when one thing changes, so does the other, right? As stamp collector attacks go up, so does his fundraising. As they go down, so does his fundraising. So there's this movement together of these two things. And when you see that, one changes, so does the other, you should think concomitant variation or correlation. Okay. So number 18, a group of scientists suspect that eating prunes causes colon cancer. To test their hypothesis, they assembled two large groups of people. The people in both groups are similar in every way except one. Those in group 1 have a diet high in prunes, and those in group 2 do not eat prunes. They discover that group 1 has a high incidence of colon cancer, whereas group 2 has a very low incidence. Which of Mill's methods is in play, and what did the scientists conclude? All right. So again, note reasoning proceeds from how the people in one group are different from the people in the other group, which should suggest something clear as far as at least one of the methods that's being used. So we know there's some method of difference going on. Now, okay, so anytime you have a comparison of two groups and you're identifying a difference that causes the difference in the groups, right, that's the method of difference, right? So what about the method of agreement here? Again, you might think, well, all the people who in this group ate prunes and all the people in this group didn't, so don't they agree about that? But again, we're talking about how they're reasoning. Mill's methods are about how we reason, right? And in this case, they're not reasoning from here's what all these people had in common, therefore that's causing X. They're saying here's how these two groups are different. And that's the basis of the conclusion, right? And again, it asks us, what do the scientists conclude? Well, if the group who have a diet high in prunes has a high incidence of colon cancer, and the group that has a diet low in prunes has a low incidence of colon cancer, then they're most likely going to conclude that prunes contribute to colon cancer, right? But again, notice the reasoning is based on the difference between these two groups, right? It's not by saying they're all similar, right? Because they're similar in every way except for one. This is the only way they're different, and so the focus here is on the difference, not the agreement. So this one, number 18, is method of difference. Okay, I guess that's it. I thought there was a number 20, but I guess not. So just to summarize, the agreement and difference can be tricky to tease apart. So just remember with agreement, there's a bunch of examples of the effect, whatever the effect is, being sick or being breaking down in the case of the computers or whatever, right? There's a bunch of examples of the effect, and a common characteristic is identified, right? So all the things that had that effect also had this characteristic, right? Whereas with difference, you're comparing two groups and seeing or identifying a difference between them, all right? So that's the main difference between the two. And again, it's possible to do both, right? Where you compare a group and you identify a difference, but then you also look at the group that has the effect and identify a common cause, right? So like in the cake baking example, right? You see that they're different. Some of them glow in the dark and some of them don't. But then the cook goes on to identify a common cause that makes them glow, which is chemical X, right? So that's when you're doing the joint method. And the joint method is obviously better. Part of the problem with the method of agreement, as you might imagine, is that just because everybody who has a certain effect had something in common, it doesn't mean that's the cause, right? So, think if a bunch of people get sick at lunch and they all ate the burger. That's not the only thing they have in common, though. They probably all go to the same school since they're eating in the cafeteria. They probably all have, 2 arms and 2 legs, right? There's a lot of things that they have in common. So just identifying a common characteristic is not always the best way to identify the cause. And also just identifying a difference between isn't necessary, right? Because probably, the person who got sick and the person that didn't, maybe they were wearing different colored clothes, right? That might have been another difference between them. So when you combine agreement and difference, you get a more powerful explanation because you're weeding out the things they have that are different between them. So the color clothes is not relevant. And while you're keeping in the things they have in common. So ideally, if you can get both, use both methods, you're going to be better off. All right, so I hope this helps. Again, there's a discussion forum for questions on the homework assigned problems, the odd number problems. So please use the discussion forums to ask questions. I am going to start having Zoom office hours, I promise. I got this laptop from the college and the microphone is having issues. So as soon as I get those set, I will start having Zoom office hours.